The disdain that we have for vulnerable people, for youth.
She was a
victim
who was crying in that moment, and she gets called a communist dissident by the governor of Florida.
She's just a kid.
She's just a kid.
The abhorrent behavior.
Just a kid.
So echoes so much of the just pathetic behavior that we see on the part of people spearing each other now. Yeah. Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. This is 50 Weeks That Shaped America, Week 19, and this week we are pairing two stories that we knew we wanted to get to in this series, 50 Weeks That Shaped America, and they each bracket 10 incredibly tense days in the spring of 1970. So as always, we're going to do this in two parts, but they're going to be a little more distinct than some of our previous conversations. Episode 1, we are going to look at the shooting at Kent State University in Ohio. Anti-war protesters gunned down by the National Guard, an indelible photo of a 14-year-old girl grieving over the body of a slain student. And then in episode 2, we'll track the mounting tension around the country after Kent State and how it culminates in many ways in New York City in mid-May with what came to be known as the Hard Hat Riots. Here, anti-war protesters were confronted by construction workers. There were huge crowds, violence, and chaos right there in Lower Manhattan. And all of the tensions of that era and that moment were playing out in public. The growing disillusionment with the Vietnam War, but also the emerging conservative backlash against the hippies. And it is hard to say as we look back and as we'll discuss which force most shaped that era and most shaped American history. Of course, it's both. It's always the dynamic between backlash and backlash to the backlash and backlash to the backlash to the backlash, same as it ever was. So, this week, Kent State, the Vietnam War, Nixon's late-night visit to the Lincoln Memorial, hippies versus hard hats on the streets of New York City, and lots more. Here, as always, Nicole Hemmer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody. Hey there.
This happens a lot on this show, but certainly in a story like this, I just have that, my gosh, what would it have been like to live in those 10 days? You know, and my parents lived in those 10 days and it formed their values and shaped them, certainly. But man, this is one of those stretches where you're like, what must life have been like in May of 1970?
Oh my gosh.
And which of those stretches are we living in now?
Right. Yeah. Did it feel like now? And, you know, for sure. One little tidbit I want to start with, and then we'll circle back to the story. But, you know, the Crosby, Stills, Nash & Young song, Ohio, of course, written about Kent State. It ends with that line over and over, 4 dead in Ohio, 4 dead in Ohio. It also starts with that line, tin soldiers and Nixon coming. That song was written by Neil Young. But, you know, the other members of the band said that Young's decision to put Nixon's name specifically in that song was like one of the ballsiest things they'd ever seen. And that song was recorded about 10 days, 15 days after the shooting and released. And a lot of radio stations, especially in Ohio, refused to play it. But it is now considered one of the best protest songs of all time. And little pop quiz for the two of you. I didn't tell you I was going to do this, but Rolling Stone named that the 9th greatest protest song of all time.
Really?
You want to take a crack at what else is in the top 10, say?
Fortunate Son.
Oh, man.
Fortunate Son is number 13 on their list.
Oh, come on. Top 10.
Close enough.
I'm drawing a blank. I mean,
We Shall Overcome.
Yeah, We Shall Overcome. Say It Loud and Black and Proud.
So We Shall Overcome is number 8. I guessed the number 1 correctly, which is, well, A Change Is Going to Come.
Of course. You know, yeah. I was going to say Sam Cooke. Yeah.
Sam Cooke.
Or Marvin Gaye, What's Going On?
Yeah, so what's going on? I was looking at this list. We could spend the whole episode doing this. But, you know, I was looking at this list. What's going on was a little lower than I thought. But, you know, it's like somewhere in that. But also these Rolling Stone lists, I mean, are total BS. But, you know, Fight the Power is number 2. Strange Fruit, Billie Holiday, number 3. You know, Respect is number 4, Aretha Franklin. You know, so you sort of get these questions like, what are protest songs?
Yeah, I was just going to say.
What are more just kind of like songs about values, right? Some of these. James Brown, as you said, Say It Loud and Black and I'm Proud, number 5. Bob Dylan, Masters of War. Nina Simone, Mississippi Goddamn. And, you know, the one last thing I'll say about this is, although maybe now I'm like, maybe we should do a special episode on the 250 protest songs that shaped America. But Mississippi Goddamn and 4 dead in Ohio. And when I look at this list, a lot of them are like Marvin Gaye, like What's Going On, or even Public Enemy, Fight the Power. They're like a little broad and a little like you can kind of interpret, and maybe that's what makes them powerful. You can interpret it in any given way.
Repurpose
like even, some of those like Bruce Springsteen songs, like Born in the USA, like a lot of people have misinterpreted that. And to me, I realize now as I think about this, 4 Dead in Ohio and Mississippi Goddamn, both of those contain state names, and both of those are among the protest songs that have always struck me as like, holy crap, they are just going right at it.
Yeah.
And so something about the specificity of, what's the other Neil Young song, Alabama, You've Got the Weight on Your Shoulders, right?
Yeah. You might even say Ray Charles, Georgia. Like, I mean, there's a lot of, I feel like there's an intentionality about making those songs sort of vague, if you will, so that people can sort of interpret them. But the ones that just sort of go for it, I'm kind of here for that. Like, because that too can become, not just a timestamp, but also timeless in the way that like these leaders are emblematic of certain ideas.
Yeah.
Right. And there's something about that specific rage that feels, it can be a little time capsule, but you can feel the events sort of pulsing behind it in a different way than in the sort of broader ones.
And, we'll spend the rest of this episode talking about the events at Kent State and the way that those just pierced through, in part because of pop culture, one, a photograph that went everywhere, and then obviously music, a song like this that captured a lot of that. So we will get into all of that. We'll talk about how the tensions at Kent State bubbled up and the tragedy of the shooting. We'll do that right after the break. But first, a quick reminder that if you are a paying subscriber to our newsletter, you get all of these episodes in advance, ad-free, full video, plus you're supporting the show. There is a free version of the newsletter as well. So go ahead and join our newsletter community however you can at thisdaypod.com. But we will be right back with our look at the tragedy at Kent State University. Let me pin this on the calendar. Monday, May 4th, 1970 is when the students at Kent State are killed by the National Guard. We will get into some of these names and these personalities a little bit more, but Sandra Schur, 20 years old, is a junior speech therapy major, and she is walking across campus, not even participating in the protests at the moment, and she sort of makes her way over there, and she's not chanted, not thrown anything. She's just hasn't even sort of set foot on Blanket Hill, which is where all these are going down. But at 12:24 p.m., 28 guardsmen on the hill, 100 yards away from where Sandra was standing, they raise their M1 rifles and they fire 67 shots in 13 seconds into the crowd. And Sandra Schur, 20 years old, just walking to class, is hit in the neck. She bleeds to death. She is one of 4 killed. Jeffrey Miller, Allison Krauss, William Schroeder are the others who are killed. 13 students are hit in total. Obviously, a tragedy. And we'll get into some of the specifics of how it all went down and why it all went down in that way. But the bigger question, of course, is what were the students doing out there? What were they protesting? And so I think this is where, and maybe this is the first Vietnam era conversation we've had so far on this series. But, we need to talk about what brought the students out there. Obviously, the protests against the Vietnam War were happening throughout the 60s and 70s, but there was a particular development in the war going on right now that really was animating everyone, right?
Right. And because it is our first time talking about Vietnam, and we're not going to get too in the weeds, but we need a little context, right? So the big overarching event was a speech that Nixon had given just a few days before, announcing that U.S. ground forces were moving from Vietnam into Cambodia, which was a widening of the war. Now, U.S. forces had actually secretly been in Cambodia for quite some time, but now it is being announced, and there was a pretty dramatic reaction to this. And the reason there was a dramatic reaction is because of how Nixon had campaigned a year and a half earlier. He had run in 1968 for president against the continuation of the Vietnam War. He said he had a secret plan to win the war. He promised this idea of Vietnamization, which was that you were going to withdraw U.S. troops and replace them with Vietnamese troops. So you could still go for the same policy aims in Southeast Asia, but you could get rid of the number one pressure on domestic politics, which was opposition to the draft and revulsion at the high casualties coming from the U.S. military and the war. And so Nixon had made this promise, and yet he got into office and he didn't end the war. And in fact, he begins to develop this political theory of a divide in the United States between a noisy minority of mostly college students and radicals who were opposed to the war, and then, as he called it in a speech he gave in November 1969, this silent majority of Americans who supported Nixon and supported his efforts in Vietnam.
Can I ask you a question about that? Because I was sort of thinking about the silent majority, which we've talked about a lot on this show, and as a huge sort of theme of this whole conversation, especially as we get into the backlash to the Vietnam protests in the second episode. I was a little surprised to note that Nixon framed the silent majority initially around Vietnam War specifically. Because in my head, it feels like it's become a much broader thing.
Absolutely.
Right? It's Archie Bunker.
Yep,
it's all these white, people with good values and good faith who are just sort of want to live their lives and back conservative traditional values. I guess I didn't know that it was originally like, actually, no, there's a silent majority that supports this war specifically.
Yeah.
Yes, it gets conflated with another term that was really popular in the Nixon era, which was Middle Americans. And Middle Americans were sort of imagined geographically as from the Midwest, as white, and as exactly what you're talking about. Like, not just the Archie Bunker type, because Archie Bunker could be kind of mean and foul-mouthed, but this kind of good, solid pioneer
apple
stuff.
pie,
hardworking, ethical. Just wants their kids to take them to softball practice and work their job.
Love the flag.
Yeah, love the flag.
And I bet a lot of them did not like the Vietnam War. So that's why I'm sort of interested to see how it sort of expanded to sort of rope in all these other issues.
Right. That conflation was a really important part of Nixon's politics, because the thing about the silent majority is there hadn't been majority support for the Vietnam War since the Tet Offensive in January of 1968. So this war was underwater. It was unpopular with the American people the entire time Nixon was in office, and it wasn't going to get more popular.
No.
So it was always a fiction, but it was a useful fiction because it was drawing these categories of, here are the real legitimate Americans, patriotic Americans, the people we should be appealing to. And here are the illegitimate ones, the radicals, the people who hate America, who grab all the headlines but actually don't speak for us. And there is something to note, which is the radicalization of the anti-war movement was happening at this time as well. There were, through the first 14 or 15 months of Nixon's presidency, 4,300 bombings across the U.S. They're not all anti-war bombings, but there is this idea that you bring the war home.
Yeah.
Right? If the U.S. is going to unleash all this violence and destruction in Southeast Asia, we're going to do that here as well. And this always happens. Imperial violence always comes home. And it was coming home in 1969 and 1970.
I also feel like the silent majority was about people who really just wanted the status quo. They just wanted America to be normal again. And coming off of the late 60s and going into the early 70s, people were fatigued. They were fatigued from all kinds of protests, be it civil rights or women's lib or, anti-war. People just wanted to go back to a sense of normalcy and normalcy, what that means, right?
Sure.
Or what that entails. Could be segregation. It could be, it could be a lot of different things, but that's really what people wanted. They wanted
peace. There it is, in all regards, right? And that's where it's if you want that stability and peace of those, to some people, halcyon days of the late 50s and early 60s, I could certainly see a world in which you say, well, an escalation of this war does not fit into that vision for me.
Yeah.
But Nixon, again, is sort of conflating all of these in an interesting way. And obviously, especially among young people, riling up a lot of big feelings. And I think it's hard to overstate how much the specific idea and the admission that there really was an escalation and an expansion into Cambodia was a huge issue, because we've seen it play out time and time again. Anti-war activists were saying, you're in Cambodia. The administration was denying it. And then they said, oh, guess what? We have been. We're mucking about, and we're taking it to another level. And, that happens. That's a dynamic we see all the time. So what then happens in the wake of this speech where Nixon on April 30th addresses the nation and says that ground forces are at that very moment crossing into Cambodia? All hell breaks loose.
you get exactly what you would expect, which is people are outraged that the war is expanding instead of contracting. And there are strikes and demonstrations all across the country, particularly on campuses, which had been the center of the anti-war movement. And like, even at this time, there had been this idea that like college kids were this coddled, privileged group. Nixon pushed that line. Pat Buchanan pushed that line. What's interesting is, like, this is the period after the GI Bill when colleges are opening up for the first time to middle class and kind of like upper working class people. They're desegregating. Women are now included on campuses. And then at a place like Kent State, this is a mid-sized state school. It's in northern Ohio, about 21,000 students. Most of the kids are first-gen students. They're commuters. This is kind of a working class campus that the Guard is coming to. But of course, this anti-war activism wasn't an upper class phenomenon, right? It crossed classes throughout the United States, especially because the working class was more vulnerable to the draft to begin with.
I mean, if you had a ticket to college, you had a ticket out of the draft. And so people saw that as sort of a class line. But really, like you were saying, Nikki, I mean, if you're first gen, you're not necessarily wealthy because you're in college. This is your first opportunity to sort of be in college.
Yeah. Not to jump too far ahead, but do you think the fact that this took place at Kent State and not Columbia or UC Berkeley or some of those other schools that are thought of as having those sort of anti-war protest, maybe coddled kid reputations, do you think that really made a difference in the way this story was perceived and broke through?
Well, I mean, not to jump ahead, but I actually think we should analyze that when we get to the aftermath, which is, this is like a bunch of working class white kids on this campus. Yeah. And they get blamed for what happens.
Well, they get blamed. That's interesting. Yeah. Obviously it's very complicated and people have very different sorts of interpretations. But I wonder what would have happened had something like this played out at a Columbia or a Berkeley. So,
I don't want to jump ahead. But it does sort of play out at Jackson State, at HBCU, and that's telling too.
And it gets ignored, and we'll talk about that for sure. So, okay, well, let's go to that weekend of May 1st through 3rd, a couple days or just 80 hours after Nixon gives his speech about expansion into Cambodia. There are protests on Kent State. So let's do the chronology. Let's do the tick-tock of how the tension ratchets up and ratchets up and ratchets up over the course of that weekend. Friday, May 1st at noon, a graduate student on campus buries a copy of the U.S. Constitution on the Commons on the theory that Nixon had killed it with his speech the night before.
Hell yeah. That's good activism. I like that.
Grab a shovel, bury it. Very symbolic. There was also this thing where, as you would say, Nixon had been disparaging protesters, and that's such a huge dynamic here. So, somewhere in that stretch, Nixon had also been caught on tape calling protesters bums blowing up campuses. So, I think there was just a dynamic here about how we're perceived, how we think about violence. Burying a constitution is a nice act. Friday night, that night, it's a warm evening, which I continue to say weather has such a huge impact on some of the ways that these stories break out. But there's more people outside. Some windows get broken in Kent, downtown Kent, in the Bard district on Water Street. Police meet, break up the crowd. The mayor of Kent was there, and he heard some rumors about a radical plot, and he declared a state of emergency, and he phones the governor in Columbus for assistance. And some National Guard officers are immediately dispatched, and they kind of start to break up those crowds. But now the National Guard is on the scene. The next day, Saturday, May 2nd at 8 o'clock, the ROTC building on the Commons is burning. A reminder that there are ROTC buildings on many of these campuses. And as we've been saying, students, kids of this age are faced with the imminent notion that they would be drafted into a war that they disagree with. So the ROTC building on campus is burned. Firemen try to put it out, but their hoses had been punctured and cut open, so they're unable to extinguish the blaze. So there you go.
I would not have thought to do that, just saying.
I should say that a lot of these details come from a writer named David Paul Kuhn, who wrote a book about the Hard Hat Riot, but also obviously this stretch in time and the post-Kent State uprisings. But he mentions in his book how, as this ROTC building is burning, students could hear all the ammunition that was inside going popping inside as it went up in flames. The National Guard clears the campus that night, Saturday, May 2nd. The next day, there's about 1,200 National Guardsmen who start to basically occupy the Kent State campus. Governor James Rhodes, who happened to be campaigning for Senate at the time, takes a helicopter over and surveys the scene. He gives a press conference in which he says he's going to, quote, use every part of the law enforcement agencies of Ohio to drive dissident groups out of Kent. He then does something that we see time and time again. He talks about the demonstrators as having a quote-unquote communist element. He says that they are worse than the brown shirts.
Worse than the brown shirts?
Yeah.
Come on.
Yeah.
And calls them bums.
And he calls them bums, yeah. So maybe let's take a moment here to get to know Governor James Rhodes, who obviously plays a big part in this story.
Yes, James Rhodes. He was a 4-term governor of Ohio. He's won 2 terms at this point. He's decided not to run for governor again, but to run for Senate. So as this is all happening, he's locked in a primary campaign for senator from Ohio. He had been seen as a kind of moderate governor. He deployed the Guard multiple times in his time in office as a way of putting down protests, as a way of putting down strikes. Interestingly, the National Guard coming to Kent State were coming from putting down a strike, so from dealing with labor to dealing with protest. So he's in the middle of this pretty heated Senate primary, and he's moving to the right. He's moving into that lane that you might call the Nixon-Wallace lane. George Wallace ran in 1968 as kind of like the populist right figure to Nixon's more standard Republican. And so Nixon also moves to the right, and he starts using this language of law and order. And Rhodes is very much a law and order guy. He believes that he should use the power of the state through the National Guard, through the police, in order to tamp down protest, tamp down unrest, and restore this kind of order that we were talking about earlier, that the silent majority or middle Americans wanted. And he was going to do it with as much violence as it required, using every weapon necessary. At one point, when he says that these students who so far have burned down an ROTC building and broken a few windows downtown, who are worse than the brown shirts and the communist element, he says they're the worst type of people that we harbor in America, and we are going to eradicate the problem. This is someone who was taking a maximalist approach and a violent approach to this confrontation with students, even before that confrontation happens. But he's really ramping it up because the events we're about to talk about, happen on May 4th. The primary is on May 5th. So he's coming into the finish line, and he doesn't want something out of control to get in the way of his odds of winning this primary.
So, yeah, the primary is Tuesday, Election Day, May 5th, but all of this really goes down on Monday, May 4th. So let's do a TikTok of that day.
Okay, so Monday, May 4th, it's noon, and students have already started to gather on what is known as like the Commons. There's this area around the Victory Bell on campus where students would come together and protest. All protests pretty much have been prohibited. Like the idea of having a rally, they have, the authorities have pretty much shut that down. But students are still coming to campus because they're going to class, and you've got thousands, really, anywhere between 1,500 to 3,000 students who are planning to protest, but also some students who are just showing up to campus. They're commuters. They're trying to get to class.
Who may not even know that the protest had been banned.
Who don't even know that the protest has been banned, and don't even know that something, may pop off. And so you have all of these guardsmen or these troops who are surrounding the campus, who are there to sort of put down or disperse any crowds that might become, a major protest. The guardsmen, we should say, were sleep deprived. They had only gotten about 3 hours of sleep the night before, which is not a great idea when you think about the fact that, like, if you're about to, have some major operation, you want your best, most readied people. So I would say they're a little bit on edge. But as students start to gather and a protest does start to form, they start to try to disperse the crowds. But no one can really hear them. They have these mechanical speakers, but it's not being heard. And if you've ever been in a crowd before and tried to hear, like, I don't know, be on the train and hear like the speaker saying the train is shut down, and you're like, what do you say? What? Like, so no one is leaving. And this is what causes a lot of the guardsmen to sort of get frustrated. They start to throw tear gas. The tear gas gets thrown back at them. Some of the students are not having that. More crowds of students start to come because people are now, wondering, okay, what's going on? Is something about to pop off?
Sorry, if I can just jump in with one thing.
Yeah.
Maybe one reason people couldn't hear folks is because one of the things that the students were doing is they're gathered around the so-called victory bell, which is in the center of campus, and they're ringing the bell.
Oh, yeah.
If you're a college kid, like it's kind of a thing you're going to do.
Yes.
You want to learn a little bit about the Kent State victory bell?
Yes.
It's a long-standing tradition. That's the only answer is yes. It's a long-standing tradition. It has stood as a symbol of Kent State pride since the early 1950s. I'm reading from the official website here. It is a massive bell, and the tradition is that it gets rung, especially after sports victories. And in recent years, they actually have built a mobile version of it so they could take it on the road and bring it back and forth and ring the victory bell. And now the 300-pound bell makes its way to and from the majority of the Kent State sports contests and is rung when the home team is victorious. And since 2016, it has now also become part of the commencement at Kent State. So when you walk up and you get your diploma, you get to ring that bell, which is pretty cool.
That is cool.
So, honestly, I like this. This is better than like 90% of the things colleges do around sports.
Yeah. Yeah.
But to your point, Jody, no one can hear the guardsmen.
And it just, it's just one of those provocative things, right? To be standing there and clanging that bell in front of the National Guardsmen.
Yes.
Yeah,
and, it's a lot of commotion going on. People are also, shouting obscenities at the guardsmen. They want them to go away. No one's happy that they're there. It's a lot going on. And so the guardsmen, start to get frustrated, and they sort of back themselves on top of this hill. And this is the thing, without anyone ever shouting orders or without anyone telling them to do this, these 28 guardsmen open up fire on these students who are on campus. And some of them are shooting their weapons in the air. Some of them are pointing, away from the crowd to sort of, scare the crowd to disperse. But some of them are shooting directly at students. And this is where you get the 67 shots in 13 seconds. And if you can imagine just the chaos and the noise of people shouting and then the bell, but then when you start to hear the gunfire going off round after round after round, you don't know where these bullets are coming from. I mean, one student, the furthest victim, Donald McKenzie, was shot at 750 feet away. That's the length of 2.5 football fields. So if you can imagine, if you're walking to class or minding your business or, thinking that you are out of range of danger, those rifles were far enough to shoot students from a great distance.
And that also means that the students were so far away from the guards.
Yes.
Right? Yeah. There's no imminent threat coming from the students when the shooting happens.
And the students are not armed. That's really important to note as well. I mean, a lot of these students who are wounded or killed, they're shot in the back while they're lying on the ground. They are shot in ways that just could not have ever been seen as a threat to these guardsmen. So 4 are killed, 9 are wounded. One of the students who was wounded, Dean Collar, was 20 years old. He takes a bullet in the spine. He's never able to walk again after this. So it is chaos that ensues. All of the guardsmen sort of plead that they feared for their lives. It's a standard sort of like line that we hear over and over again. But people aren't buying it because they're like, again, the students were unarmed and this person was...
And you literally had the higher ground.
You had the higher ground and these students were far away. Yeah. But it doesn't still really play into the students' favor.
What do you make of the fact that we seemingly still don't know who ordered those shots fired? I mean, that is, so much of a key thing that all incidents like this. I mean, I think about, almost every incident of violence involving, the police, like it's about where did the order come from? What was the motivation for shooting? But I think about even 2 years earlier, those protests at the DNC that got violent, and so much of that trial, the Chicago 7 and everything was about like, what was the specific inciting incident that led to someone to give the orders and so forth. And the fact that we still don't know. And that so many shots were fired.
Yes, so many.
It's just stunning to me.
It's stunning, and it also is. I mean, I think about these soldiers. How old were they? They would have been peers with these students in a lot of ways. They couldn't have been more in their teens or 20s. And so you think about like how people are making rash decisions or decisions based off of panic or decisions based off of the fact that, you're not sort of your best self, is when you're sleep deprived or whatever. Not blaming it solely on the sleep, but I do think that there's an element of like fatigue that goes into people making rash decisions that don't make sense.
And in an atmosphere where the governor had made it pretty clear that, like, this was a problem we need to eradicate. It's interesting, Kelly, you also mentioned that their peers, one of the students who shot and killed is a member of the ROTC.
Yeah.
Like, they're literally peers. Like, they're in some ways brothers in arms. But that's not how they're necessarily being seen by the guards in that moment, right? They're being seen as an enemy that has to be controlled in some way.
Yeah. I mentioned Sandra Schurer, who was 20 years old, who was the one who was just walking across campus and sort of seeing this play out and looking down from the top of the hill and then, ends up getting shot and killed. Let's talk a little bit about Allison Krauss, who's 19 years old, an honor student. She is 343 feet away and is shot and in the chest and killed. She had been part of the protests. She was an art major. Her father, Arthur Krauss, was an employee at Westinghouse in Pittsburgh. In the day before the shootings, Allison had been out there and had actually had a moment that a lot of people then recalled where she was talking with a National Guardsman who had a flower protruding from the barrel of his rifle. Then, presumably she had put it there. But this was obviously a big sign. I think there's famous photographs that show these moments. This was a big act of protest. She had put a flower in his rifle, and another officer came and was upset and took the flower away and threw it on the ground. And she was overheard to have said, "Flowers are better than bullets." She's out there the next day protesting. She's shot again more than 300 feet away in the chest, killed. A couple days later, her father, Arthur Krauss, wrote a letter to Nixon. It was published in the New York Times, and he says, "Have we come to such a state in this country that a young girl has to be shot because she disagrees deeply with the actions of her government?" And then when he's on national TV and talking about her death, he says, echoing the words that Nixon had used to talk about the protesters, she said, "My child was not a bum." But that question that he asks, have we come to such a state in this country? That is the question that I think the country is asking in the wake of this, in particular because of the power of that famous photograph taken just in the aftermath of this at Kent State. And it was taken by a man named John Philo, 21-year-old photojournalism senior at Kent State. And we should spend a little time talking about the people in that photograph and the power of that photograph.
Yeah, the photographs that Philo takes, and he takes multiple photos, we should say. You can see sort of like a whole spread of like crowds, people running away, people sort of confused about what's going on, people just trying to get to cover or to get to safety. But the most striking photo is this photo that we later find out is a 14-year-old girl who's not a student at Kent State at all. She's a runaway from Florida. And her name is Mary Ann Vecchio. And she sees Miller's body, who's one of the victims, drops down to her knees, lets out this cry, this wail of like, oh my gosh. And you see, Miller's body on the ground. It is a gripping photo of just terror and fear and confusion, even for the people who are sort of standing around her.
Yeah.
And it really encapsulates everything that I think the students were feeling, the campus was feeling, quite frankly, the country was feeling at how could these students have been murdered in broad daylight from a great distance, unarmed. And that image shaped the entire sort of feeling or encapsulated so much about that moment.
It is the image that you see when somebody says Kent State.
Yes.
It is that famous. Like, it gets on the wires right away. It runs in all of the major newspapers, and it becomes one of the indelible images of the era.
Yeah. Philo won a Pulitzer Prize for that photograph. He was 22, one of the youngest winners ever in the photo for a Pulitzer Prize for photography. That photo, which we'll put in the newsletter, obviously, if you're watching the video version of this, we'll put it in the video. I think a lot of people can picture it as well. Obviously, the anguish on Mary Ann Vecchio's face and the dead body of Miller are the centerpiece of it. But I am so struck by just all the other people sort of walking around in a daze. You know, just like, how did this happen? And I mean, in there, obviously they're in shock, but I kind of just see America in all of them, you know, just sort of wandering through space saying, as we heard from that father, you know, how have we come to such a state in this country?
Yeah. And it's listen, it is always deeply unsettling to see a dead body, you know, in the cover of a magazine or in a newspaper. It just is striking. And I think that like that image sits like so many other iconic images of that era where you see that involve violence, where you see people being terrorized by a gun or being threatened with a gun. I mean, it just, it represents death, just so much death, unnecessary death in a lot of ways.
And Kelly, what do we know about the girl in that photo? Because I think, Jody, you mentioned in the introduction that this is a 14-year-old.
14-year-old
does not look like a 14-year-old. No,
she does not. But in that picture, to me, she looks like a grown woman. But she was a runaway from Florida. She gets identified. She gets picked up by the authorities. But even though the girl is 14 and has nothing to do with, you know, sort of the uprising, they label her as a communist. They say she's a dissident. You know, she gets harassed for years. Really for something that was outside of her control, that she was never trying to participate in. And it's not until 1995, 25 years later, where she and Philo actually meet up in person, and he like gives her an autographed copy of this photo, and inscribes on it, "For the courageous Mary Ann Vecchio, I cannot fathom how this photograph affected your life. I'm proud to call you friend."
I find that so moving. The bond between these two people who didn't know each other and didn't meet until 25 years later. But I want to go back to the fact that this 14-year-old girl who's a runaway and finds herself on campus and then finds herself letting out a cry of anguish. She basically, in the wake of this, you know, flees, goes back to Florida, and the governor of Florida calls her a communist and a dissident. And she spends years getting harassed.
Just a kid.
She's just a kid.
The abhorrent behavior. And, you know, and it so echoes so much of the just sort of, I don't know, pathetic behavior that we see on the part of people spearing each other now. Yeah.
Yes. And the disdain that we have for vulnerable people, for youth, for, you know.
But she was not politicizing this moment.
No.
She was not. She was a
kid
a
victim
who was crying in that moment. And she gets called a communist dissident by the governor of Florida.
But the way that, I mean, this, I think, maybe gets to a question you asked earlier, Jody. Like, the victims here are turned into the aggressors in the telling of it, right? She's called a dissident, and she's arrested for being a witness to this event. There are rumors going around that the reason why that the guard shot was because a sniper shot at them first, something that never happened. But this idea that the guardsmen are the victims of Kent State has real currency. There, you know, in polls that come out after, 58% of Americans blame the students for what happened, and like 11% or so blame the guard. It's deeply lopsided.
That to me was wild. Like, I don't know how you see those images. I don't know how you see students murdered from yards and yards away, football fields away, and have no compassion, you know, for their circumstances. Yeah. I mean, it just shows you the level of disdain that people had for college protesters.
And, you know, that is obviously the going to be the thrust of our next episode, where we really see that play out on the streets of New York City. But of course, I'm reminded of the fact that just a couple weeks ago, we talked about the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr. And many Americans, when polled in the wake of that, were like, he kind of had it coming. And so, you know, this dynamic is out there. That's not to say that this also didn't play out in the wake of this on college campuses and ratchet up the tension there. And so obviously this photo goes everywhere. There's news reports. Everyone's reacting to it.
Oh, we should also say, I mean, the guardsmen are never criminally convicted. There's a case that ends in acquittal. There's a civil suit in which the families of the victims and those who had been shot were paid $675,000. And they had to sign a statement expressing regret, but not an apology for what happened.
So campuses around the country continue to erupt. There's fires set on Stony Brook campus in Long Island. The University of Alabama, there's arsonists struck the gym there. There's firebombs at the Ohio University. A lot of ROTC buildings are targeted. We did mention that on May 14th, 10 days after Kent State, 2 students were killed and 12 were wounded by police at Jackson State University, an HBCU in Jackson, Mississippi. Those killings do not get nearly as much national attention. Recently, there's been some really incredible scholarship about that incident as well. A number of the reaction to this and fall to this happens in New York City, and I want to kind of like cast our attention to New York City because that's where the episodes that were the incidents of our second episode are going to play out. But, Columbia University, obviously, large legacy of protests there. Students occupied an administration building. Students blocked the West Side Highway during rush hour in those second week of May. And then one of my favorite tidbits in all this is at NYU, students hold a $3 million computer hostage. So there's some big research computer on campus and they grab it and they hold it ransom and claim that the proceeds are going to go to the Black Panthers. I don't know if they ever got that.
I doubt they got that money.
That math
I think
computer.
they got that money.
But I love the idea of taking a computer hostage. It's very, yes.
And those schools close, right? Like they shut down.
Yeah, for weeks.
In order to...
I mean, Kent State was shut down for 6 weeks.
Do you have any quick thoughts about how Nixon reacts to this? Obviously, he is in many ways, animating force to all of these tensions, specific and broader.
Honestly, Nixon has kind of a meltdown over these many days, but his specific response to Kent State, he'd been taking a nap when it happened, and he woke up, and H.R. Haldeman, who's his chief of staff, tells him what's happening, and he's really disturbed by it. In that Kuhn book we talked about earlier, he talks about how Nixon recalls that he couldn't get the photographs out of his mind, that he kept thinking about his daughters, who were not that much older than the students at Kent State, and really felt like it was one of the darkest moments of his presidency. But I do want to note what he said when he addressed the country. He said in a statement that night, "This should remind us all once again that when dissent turns to violence, it invites tragedy." Who is he blaming for this?
Yeah.
He's blaming the student protesters. They invited tragedy, and tragedy came to them.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he kept also trying to look for evidence that would confirm that the students themselves were violent.
Provoked.
Yeah.
Yeah. In New York City, the Republican mayor, who we'll talk about a little bit in the next episode, John Lindsay, he orders the flags at City Hall lowered to half staff, and that apparently is a big controversial incident. There's maybe even some reporting that some people tried to raise it back up. And, I mentioned the flag because the flying of the American flag, and in particular during acts of protests, people who were against the protesters grabbing an American flag and starting to wave it in front of the protest is going to be at the heart of the so-called hard hat riots that play out just about 10 days after Kent State. And that is the focus of our next episode. We will go to New York City and we will look at the protests that are responding to Kent State, but then the backlash that represents what Nixon would like to characterize as the so-called silent majority in this country. So that is all coming up in our next episode. But for now, we bring this episode to a close. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
Hello and welcome to This Day, a history show from Radiotopia. My name is Jody Avirgan. We are in part 2 of week 19 of 50 weeks that shaped America. This week, we are kind of breaking it into 2 distinct but very clearly related stories. Last episode, we talked about the shooting at Kent State University in Ohio and how, especially on the back of a very powerful photograph, the nation is shocked. There are protests around the country, but there is a lot of skepticism and backlash to what student protesters represent. We talked about how 58% of Americans polled in that moment basically said these kids had it coming. Now, this episode, we cut to New York City about a week later, May 8th, and the so-called hard hat riots. This is where students in New York City are staging massive protests in response to what they saw play out at Kent State, But in real time, on the street, people start to push back, especially groups of construction workers who are in downtown Manhattan and who, come to represent that so-called silent majority that Richard Nixon is trying to rally around both the Vietnam cause and larger questions about what counts as patriotism and the American identity in this moment. So let's get into it all here. As always, Nicole Hammer of Vanderbilt and Kelly Carter-Jackson of Wellesley. Hello there.
Hello, Jody.
Hey there.
We talked a little bit about Nixon's immediate response to Kent State. He wakes up from a nap. He gives a speech in which he basically blames the protesters. Anything else to say about Nixon before we get to New York City on that fateful day of May 8th?
I mean, I want to talk about how he responds to it all. He goes nuts. I don't know if folks have seen the Oliver Stone Nixon, the movie. It's wild, but it shows like Nixon unraveling in the aftermath of Watergate. He's on pills. He's drinking tons of alcohol. You kind of get a glimpse of that Nixon and like the spiral that Nixon is in way earlier, because after the hard hat riots, he goes on television. He does a press conference. By all reports, it goes really well. And so he spends that whole evening calling conservative leaders, labor leaders, all of these different people, and getting just like pumped up by them. They're all telling him how great he is, how wonderful of a job he's done. He's wired. He feels on top of the world. And so he gets a little bit of sleep. He wakes up at 4 a.m. He puts on Rachmaninoff at a loud volume. Is just like conducting it in his mind, sitting there in the Lincoln sitting room in these pre-dawn hours. And he gets this great idea to go down to the Lincoln Monument where there are student protesters gathered. Just vibe with them. Just hang. Just
out.
Have a moment.
Show up. Richard Nixon, show up, talk to a bunch of 20-year-olds who are protesting.
This man is not
That's
sober.
Crazy.
I guarantee you this man is not sober.
Oh, my gosh. Hey, guys, there's no way.
This has been portrayed in a bunch of movies. Was this portrayed in Forrest Gump, I think?
Yes.
And then I did did the West Wing do a version of this or something? Yeah. This is Nixon's famous late night visit to vibe with protesters at the Lincoln Memorial. Do you have any details from what goes on in that late night conversation? He doesn't play Rachmaninoff for them.
Well, he didn't. Yeah, he doesn't have a portable
record player.
Record player to take with him. He really does just hang out with students. He chats them up, asks them what they're studying, how old they are. The students, I think the student reaction is kind of interesting because they're kind of like, what is happening?
What are you doing here?
Yeah.
Why are you here? What's going on?
Where's your security?
So look, a lot of this is in the wake of this press conference that he gives on May 8th, which is the night of the hard hat riots. We're going to get into the hard hat riots. But it is remarkable that he thinks, and I think generally the public like kind of thinks he nails it in that moment. And that's the big dynamic here, right? Is like they kind of feel like, oh, I'm speaking for this silent majority, even as we're seeing all this stuff play out on campuses and in New York City. It's so funny. I was looking at that press conference on YouTube, and even the contemporary YouTube comments are kind of like, yeah, Nixon did a pretty good job here. It's like, people kind of think he nailed it. But I want to go back to something you mentioned, Nikki. It was like he's so fired up from that press conference that he just starts calling folks. And I'm looking at a log of his phone calls that night, and it's like 1:07 a.m. He calls his director of communications, Herbert Klein, and they talk for 5 minutes. 1:13 a.m. he calls Nancy Dickerson, mother of John Dickerson, correspondent for National Broadcasting Corporation. 1:18 he calls his press secretary. 1:22 he calls someone from UPI. The call was they didn't answer the phone. 1:26 he talks with someone named C.G. Rebozo in Key Biscayne, Florida.
Oh, yeah, BP Rebozo. He's his pal down in...
Yeah, there you go. 1:29 he calls his Attorney General, John Mitchell. Then he calls Governor Thomas Dewey at 1:31. 1:41 he makes a call. 1:51 he makes a call. 1:55 he calls Kissinger.
Go to bed.
Just
go to bed.
Yeah, there is a gap between 1:55 and 3:24 a.m., which presumably is when he's listening to Rachmaninoff. And then he starts calling the West Coast. He knows that there's a little time zone difference here. So he starts calling people in Los Angeles. He calls Ziegler back again at 3:47 a.m. I mean, he is just like amped up and maybe a little out addled. Is that the right word?
I mean, he was famous for making sort of drunken phone calls in the evenings. But I also first of all, amazing. But I think that the big news of the evening is going down, and these students, after they're kind of what the is Nixon doing here? They actually get into a debate with him. He's telling them, "You're young, you should travel, go see the world," and they're like, "Wait, what? No, we want to talk about the war and this cause Cambodia? That we're willing to die for." And he's like, "Well, ending the war isn't going to solve the spiritual hunger we all have." And they're like, "We're not high enough to have this conversation with
you." He's so amped up that apparently he wants to walk back for the last half mile to the White House, and his security guards and the aides are like, no, get in the car.
Get in the car.
And maybe go get some sleep. So anyway, that is the night of May 8th. And obviously, the focus of today's conversation is the day of May 8th. So let's talk about how tension starts to ratchet up in New York City leading to that day. So as I said, a lot of protests are breaking out in New York City. Obviously, there's a bunch of college campuses in New York that have a rich protest tradition, but it's also spilling out into the city itself. And so 2 days after Kent State, 2,000 nursing and medical students march from City Hall down to downtown Manhattan. And in that moment, this is on the 3rd or the 4th of May, there's a bunch of construction going on in downtown Manhattan. It's just important to point that out, that there's just a lot of skyscraper. There's always construction going down, but especially in this moment, there's a lot of new buildings being built in lower Manhattan. And they pass all these construction sites. And in this moment, a bunch of construction workers jump out, they grab an American flag, and they head to the front of the march, and they start to wave that flag and wave that flag. And there's a little bit of a scuffle there, but it sort of shows that this dynamic is out there. The young protesters are walking through the street. They're kicking over trash cans, holding up traffic. They're shouting, "Avenge Kent State." And, then they're being heckled by, a lot of times, construction workers.
I mean, look, the man had a rough tenure in office, so it's good that he had a few laughs at the beginning.
Yeah. But, he's kind of on the side of the protesters in many ways. And he's both creating space for them. He calls it for a day of reflection, and he's also just sort of sympathetic to their cause. But that day of May 8th, it's a kind of misty, cold morning. It's starting to rain a little bit.
Your weather theory is going out the window.
My weather theory might be going out the window. People are like, today might be a little calmer than we think. And no, it does not play out that way at all.
No. And typically, sunny days, perfect weather for a protest. But protesters do gather in lower Manhattan. They gather around Wall Street, around Federal Hall, the statue where George Washington first took his presidential oath of office. And they are there with their signs, and they are shouting. And as one protester put it, said, "We're going to close down the financial centers of this country because they help carry on the war." And so they are ready to have their protest, and thousands of people are gathering. And here's the thing. Police had been warned, hey, there's going to be, a demonstration. Hey, we think there's going to be a counter demonstration. Construction workers are, going to plan also an attack on student demonstrators. We should have enough security. And some of the warnings were literally coming from these hard hats themselves that were like, yeah, we're going to go, break some skulls. We're going to go rough up some of these young student protesters. And so it wasn't as though they were oblivious to the fact that something might pop off during the day. But as more students start coming into lower Manhattan, you have these counter protesters that are also amassing really large crowds, and they're chanting as well. All the way, USA, love it or leave it. And one of the things that sort of pops off the chaos that's about to erupt is the issue of the flag. People were upset that the flag was missing, and allegedly, it wasn't hoisted because of the rain. It wasn't like a political statement or anything like that. But a lot of the workers took this as an un-American position, that the flag was not being raised. And so they start to break out into these fistfights. And the fistfights, at first it's a skirmish here or there, and the next thing you know, it looks like a battlefield. You see bloody noses, you see people being punched, you see people being rolled up in a ball and they're being kicked and stomped.
In lower Manhattan, in the heart of the financial district.
Yes. Yeah. And it is so chaotic. It's almost sort of hard to tell, like, who's who a little bit if you're looking at a lot of these pictures, because to me, this is the one moment where I looked, I was like, don't see too many black people here. But
well, that's true. But some of them have long hair, and some of them are wearing hard hair.
Yes, you have a lot of what you would say your stereotypical hippie and your stereotypical construction worker. Literally breaking out into fisticuffs. And the cops are not really shutting it down. Some of them are enabling a lot of this, especially in support of the construction workers. And it just gets terrible. I mean, the footage, you can watch the terror. It feels like it's going on for hours of nonstop, I don't know, like gladiator to the death type of fighting.
Yeah. People are being badly injured. They're being carried off from their injuries. Rioters are using their hard hats to beat people with. And you also have this is such a great moment of symbolism, as awful as this whole event is. In addition to like the tossing over the flag, you have these finance workers taking ticker tape from the stock market and like raining it over and cheering on the hard hat rioters for beating up the protesters. And like, there's no greater symbol than having like finance way above the Malay.
They get to lord over it.
Yes, people are fighting in the streets.
Absolutely,
feels very much like class wars. I mean,
but it's class wars where like the rich people are on the side of the hard hats, against the students.
But they're not fighting. They're not the ones who are
I mean, again, it's rich man's war, poor man's fight. Like that's literally what you're seeing on the ground.
Yeah. But, socially, class and socially, like those finance people probably had more in common with some of the protesters who, maybe came from Columbia or NYU.
Yes, so or who were in school studying, business or accounting.
Yeah. Yeah.
Well, that business thing is an important one because after they leave the kind of area around City Hall, the hard hat rioters go up to Pace University. And there's an anti-war banner there. It's a college campus. So, of course, there's some protesting happening there. A worker shouts to kill the long-haired bastards, and they start beating up students. Pace was a business school.
Yeah.
Like, it's just a conservative school where, like, accounting is the most popular major. But here you have students being beaten because they're symbols of what these construction workers are fighting against.
About 1 in 4 of the injured were women. 6 people are arrested. Only 1 construction worker is arrested by police on that day. Police, by all account, are sort of standing to the side, maybe even just sort of facilitating the counter-protesters a little bit. The New York Post the next day calls it a wild swinging melee. I want to talk about, and this gets to the big dynamics that this represent. But I want to talk about this question of how did these construction workers end up there? How did they end up pushing back and fighting back? How coordinated was this, both in a tactical sense and in an ideological sense? And so to set up that conversation, I want to ask the two of you. There's a quote from one of the hard hats who is a big guy with an iron cross on his helmet. And he's written on that helmet, it says, "It's about time the silent majority made some noise." So going back to that thing we talked about in the first episode, where Nixon, gives a speech a few months earlier about the silent majority and frames it as people who support the Vietnam War. At this moment, I'm curious what the two of you think that hard hat is thinking about when he says it's the silent majority is making some noise right now. And moreover, had that phrase become so in the culture by that point that this guy would just, on his own volition, frame things in that way?
It was absolutely ubiquitous. Yeah. When Nixon deploys that term, he's not the first person ever called the silent majority, but it really does become a touchstone right away.
It gives people a frame.
Yeah. It gives people a frame, but it also gives them legitimacy.
Yeah.
Right? Because again, they're not in the majority, and also they weren't that silent. But in this moment, it's like we have been unjustly oppressed, and that idea as a engine for politics and as an engine for violence, it has a lot of power in U.S. history. And so here you have this hard hat worker who, by the way, probably has some oppression that he is dealing with. I mean, unions are being shut down. There were a bunch of steel workers who had lost their job recently. Their strikes get put down by the police. They're not living the life that the finance workers are living.
Yeah.
But they do. I mean, I don't know that they necessarily see it as much about the war as about America. Like, do you stand with America? Do you stand for the flag? Do you stand for all those things that we think it stands for? Or are you against it? And that seems to be the framework that a lot of the construction workers are seeing this fight in terms of.
Yeah, and a lot of these construction workers, they are peers with or the sons of or brothers of people who are being sent off to Vietnam. And so they deeply resent the fact that they're off fighting this war, or their children or their friends are off fighting this war. And you have these college students who, to them, lead these cush lives, these safe, protected lives away from the war. And they have the audacity to sort of like, you know, poo-poo the military, or the audacity to sort of like not give respect to the troops. I mean, that I feel like is where that rage is coming from, that you should just comply. You should just do what you're told. You should just fall in line. And I mean, that, I don't know how much that served them in their own lives, but like you really see this resentment about who's able to be in a space that's protected. But back to the, you know, the episode that we had previously, again, a lot of this New York City, these college students are not all born with a silver spoon. Some of them are, again, going to college for the first time. This is the first opportunity that they have. And they're not that much different, or would not have that many sort of different experiences from the people who were construction workers.
It's interesting, Kelly, because, you know, my dad was a construction worker in this period. And because he wasn't in college, he gets drafted to go to the Vietnam War. But of course, you're only there for like 1 or 2 years. And so it's also possible that a lot of these construction workers were veterans.
Totally.
Done their stint and made it back.
And so what we're describing here, just to name it, you know, is the way in which especially white working class rage gets to kind of get consolidated in this very tricky positioning.
Yes.
But, you know, a lot of that is the work of a man named Peter Brennan, who we did an episode about the Hard Hat Riots that goes a little more in depth into Brennan himself. But, you know, he is basically a union leader at this point, a labor boss at this point, and he's the one who kind of finds a stance for a lot of labor in this moment around these issues, especially around the war, where, to your point, Nikki, they're not pro-war, but they're not anti-war. They really are anti-war. And that is the kind of positioning here. No, it's
they're opposed to the anti-war movement.
They're opposed to the anti-war movement and all it symbolizes about class and race and so forth. And it's a way to separate themselves from the other progressive causes, but not necessarily say we support this war, because to your point, Nikki, a lot of them had probably gone to the war and not had a great experience or were being considered drafted. And so there's this anti-war lane that they are able to find. And I think that's the animating dynamic that's going on the streets of New York on May 8th. And the real question with this Brennan guy, of course, is how much is he both positioning and sort of picking up on these strands within his workers, and how much is he coordinating with Richard Nixon? And so there's been tons of reporting on this, tons of questions about this, about how much were they basically put up to create this moment. And, you know, by all accounts, he had been in touch with Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman. They kind of had suggested to them that maybe some of you guys want to go down there and confront some of these protesters. Nixon certainly loves the hard hats. You know, apparently that night he's said, you know, he's quoted as saying, "Thank God for the hard hats." Brennan would later say the unions had nothing to do with this riot, that there was no coordination.
Yeah.
But, you know, we keep mentioning this.
Yeah.
We keep mentioning this definitive book by is it David Kuhn?
David Kuhn.
By David Kuhn. And he basically says, like, look, you can find all sorts of indications of what is coordination, what is facilitation. He's like, at the very least, these were facilitated and cheerleaded by the administration. Was there actual coordination? Who knows? Were these paid protesters? Who knows? I don't know a single protester who's gotten paid before. But
in this case, I mean, there were local shop stewards who were encouraging workers to counter demonstrate. They were offering cash bonuses. Like, they're not like handing them 20s, but they're encouraging them from their job position.
And a few days later, a lot of these guys end up going to the White House. There's a famous photo with Nixon holding a hard hat and the flag pin.
Yes, the famous flag pin, the lapel pin that now every single president wears on their lapel.
Yeah. Brennan becomes the Secretary of Labor after this. Come on. And as you mentioned earlier, the police had advance notice.
Yeah.
Clearly something was coordinated because everyone knew it was coming.
Yeah.
And I think that's also important to underscore what an important political strategy this is, because labor had been a core part of the Democratic coalition. And it is in this moment that Nixon is trying to figure out, how do you pry people out of that Democratic coalition? Well, here's how we're going to get Catholics. Here's how we're going to get the South. And here's how we're going to get labor. And in fact, when he runs again in 1972, labor sort of says, okay, well, we're not going to pick a side, when that had been a core Democratic constituency. So this actually, it works.
Yeah.
So was it coordinated? Everything we know about the Nixon White House and everything we know about his relationship with Brennan, it wasn't not coordinated.
Yes. Tell me you're not bedfellows when you become the Secretary of Labor. That was a reward. That was not a position earned. That was, hey, thanks for helping out. Thanks for bringing some more votes to the party.
Okay, we've been running long on this. I mean, this is basically two stories.
I know, it's a lot.
It's really fascinating. One more little detail, but then I want to get to these big ideas about backlash and backlash to the backlash and so forth. But it is funny that in the days after this hard hat riot, it's actually construction workers who seem to be the kind of very politically engaged in this moment. And so a few days later, there's a rally with several thousand workers near City Hall, and they call John Lindsay a commie rat. And then on May 20th, there's 150,000 construction workers, longshoremen, and others gather outside City Hall. And one magazine called it Workers' Woodstock. So, now all of a sudden the hard hats have sort of embraced this spirit of protest.
Yes.
And then, as we said, later in May, Peter Brennan leads a delegation of 22 union leaders to the Oval Office, and we kind of see that marriage of white working class grievance and Nixon politics.
And this would explain the 58% of Americans that say the students were to blame for their own deaths at Kent State.
Right. So this is my question. Is Nixon genuinely picking up on an emerging dynamic in American politics, or is he at some level creating it a little bit too?
Both.
Yeah.
I think it's both. And I think it's, as we think about the shifting political attachments of the white working class, there is an economic dislocation happening. This is the beginning of rapid inflation, of deunionization, of lower wages. All of that stuff is happening to the working class writ large. You also have the Black Civil Rights Movement, women entering the workforce in larger numbers. You have these student protests and college students who are having different set of opportunities in a different kind of labor market. And part of what politics is doing, what politicians are doing in this moment, are they're telling the white working class, the reason why things are going so bad is because Black people are taking your jobs and women are taking your jobs, and these college students hate America, and they're the reason the country is in decline. And I'm not saying they're it's not I don't think it's false consciousness or anything.
Right.
But there's a politics here of who's to you are oppressed, you are losing out, and who is to blame for that. And that's where Nixon and his coalition come in, because they're both setting up that question by saying you're an oppressed majority, and then following it up with, and here's who to blame.
Yeah.
And it becomes a winning formula for Nixon, who wins 49 states in the 1972 election. I mean, just call it a landslide.
Enormous landslide.
Yeah, enormous landslide.
And everything goes well from there.
And everything goes well for Nixon and for this country from there. And this question of white grievance politics never emerges.
Look how great it is when you overcome polarization.
Yes, that's
Everything
true.
is fine.
Oh, man.
Okay, to take an even further step back and to ask an even more complicated question, more naively, let me ask you this, which I've been thinking about. One of the big lessons I've learned doing this show with the two of you, and that I think about, is that, backlash politics is such a driving force in American history, all the way from, Reconstruction, all the way through women's rights, gay rights, as we're saying here, civil rights, anti-war. And I guess my question is, first off, for most of my life, I've thought, well, okay, 2 steps forward, 1 step back. But sometimes I wonder if it's 2 steps forward, 3 steps back in the grand math of it all. And I wonder, why is it easier to be against something than for something? Why does backlash politics seem to be so much more powerful and so much easier to generate? And that every time there is a movement that seems to be for something, the backlash seems much more sort of ready and willing to just sort of take over.
I feel like because the backlash, progress is coming from the underdog, right? Progress is coming from those who have been denied or marginalized, the so-called losers of society. So backlash is always going to come from the winners. Backlash is always going to come from those, at least, who have more a position of power or protection, and they are hell-bent on maintaining that power and that position. And even little symbolic chips at their shield of protective power feels like an all-out assault to them. And so that's why I feel like you see that backlash. We never sort of have like a backlash from people who don't have power. The backlash is always from people who are trying to maintain it.
Yeah, I would agree with Kelly on the power and resources front. Like the infrastructure is there already. I would also say that nostalgia is in some ways a more powerful emotion than hope. Because nostalgia says this thing once existed and we can make it exist again. And hope says, let me take you to a world that's never existed and make you believe in it.
Something new.
And those are both really powerful, but like nostalgia is so toxic because it takes the past and it weaponizes it
right.
in many ways. It doesn't feel like hatred. It feels like getting back to the good life that you once had. But of course, it comes at the cost of other people's equality. But I think we see that time and time again in politics, that you want to believe that the electorate is more motivated by hope for a better future, but that they're more powerfully moved by the promise of a return to a golden past.
Oh, that's so good, Nikki. That's going in my book. So good.
I mean, look, I think that is spot on. And part of that dynamic is that it's just easier to confront something that you see and is tangible or that you've known from the past than it is to tell a story about an unknown or something you hope to create.
Yes.
And I think it's a reminder that, like, if you're trying to tell a story about a better future, like, you have to work doubly hard to paint that picture.
Because you can't show it.
Give it to people, and have them actually be concrete. And so, part of me is just not surprised that people more readily go to backlash or being against something than they are to be for something, because the stuff to be against is much more tangible.
It's the devil you know
and sometimes,
versus the devil you don't.
And sometimes that's a war, right? Sometimes it's a war, and the backlash politics is anti-war. But I think it's something I think about a lot right now, is just that the hard work it takes to tell a story about what could be, not just rail against what is. That's where real progress comes, I think. Certainly in this moment, I'm thinking about it. But yeah.
And the hard work that it takes to build something versus tearing it down.
Gosh.
I mean, this is the lesson of the last few years for certain, is like, it's so easy to destroy things, whether it's the East Wing of the White House or, the
Voting Rights
social
Act.
movements of the 1960s. But to put that back together, to build something new, that's much harder.
Take centuries.
It's a much bigger project.
It could take decades. It's oh man, it's depressing me.
Okay. I'm sorry to depress you, and I won't ask whether you think it's 2 steps forward, 1 step back, or 2 steps forward, 3 steps back. But
1 step forward, 3 steps back. Sometimes.
Oh boy. Okay, we have this photo that, as we talked about last episode, really stopped people in their tracks. Mary Ann Vecchio kneeling over the body of Jeffrey Miller. We did sort of point out she's 14 years old in that photo, and if you look at it, I mean, she looks like she's in her late 20s or 30s. I mean, she does not look like she's a 14-year-old. And I've been wanting to ask you, and this is as good of a chance as any to ask you. It's like, people looked older back in the day, right? Like you look at photos even from like the 80s and you're like, this is a high school.
Yes.
Like do you have either of you have a working theory for why that is?
I feel like a couple things. The glasses were bigger. Like way bigger. Like the clothes that people wore. Like I watched an old movie and I was like, wait, why is she dressed like that? She's like 33, but she's...
There wasn't like teen culture in a way.
There was not.
Is that your theory, Nikki?
Well, I mean, there is a fashion side of things, which is absolutely true, that it's only you're starting to get the rise of like the youth market, but you don't have the same quickness of fashion. And you also don't have the same wealth for people to be able to tap into those new fashion markets. But actually, no, I think it has to do with smoking and healthcare in general.
I was going to say that. Is there a skincare thing going on here?
But skincare too, absolutely.
I buy
like
this.
I didn't grow up with a skincare
No
routine.
Sephora?
Right. And even if you didn't smoke, like every room you went into was full of smoke.
Yeah, my dad.
But like
smoked,
even
so,
even videos like you open Instagram, you see these nostalgia videos of like high school kids in like the late 80s, and they look like they're in their 20s and 30s. You know,
they do.
And so
even pictures. I've seen pictures of like my mom when she was young, and I was like, "How old are you? 23?" And she was like, "I was 12." I was like, "What?"
Amazing.
It's the haircut.
Wow. Quite a microaggression against your mom there, Kelly.
Yeah, seriously. Well, anyway, I like all these theories. Maybe listeners have theories as well.
So give them to me. This is something I love thinking about.
I think about this a lot too. But anyway, that will bring us to the end of this episode. Really fascinating. I'm glad we got both these stories, paired them together, and got to some big ideas. Nicole Hemmer, thanks to you as always.
Thank you, Jody.
And Kelly Carter-Jackson, thanks to you.
My pleasure.
This Day is a proud member of Radiotopia, a network of independent, artist-produced, listener-supported podcasts. Don't forget to sign up for our America 250 Watch newsletter. Every Thursday, you'll get exclusive access to analysis and information about the semi-quincentennial, commentary from our team, and a list of fascinating things that happened that week throughout history. And on Sundays, for our paid subscribers, you get early, ad-free access to our 50 Weeks That Shaped America series, plus other bonus conversations throughout the year. Join in, find out lots more, support the show at thisdaypod.com. You can also follow This Day Pod on Instagram, Blue Sky, and on YouTube. Get in touch with ideas or feedback at thisdaypod@gmail.com. Jacob Feldman is our researcher. Kala Nakua does our transcripts. Special thanks to Audrey Martovich, Yuri Lasordo, and everyone at Radiotopia. Extra special thanks to you for listening, subscribing, rating and reviewing, and telling others about the show. My name is Jody Abergan. We'll see you soon.